So I'm gonna not ask several of my questions because last time that just derailed the conversation for like 20 minutes. I'm just gonna ask one really annoying question, which is why is this book, why is it philosophy instead of just self-help for intellectual Christians and a self-help manual for converting particularly intellectual non-Christians? Why is it philosophy? But yeah, maybe it is both. I don't know. Maybe we don't have to talk about that either. It's just I'm reading this thing and it's like, okay, so I'm in despair. You're telling me how to get out of despair. Okay, so why is this philosophy? I mean, I guess I could think, I mean, what my mind immediately goes to is, well, the way Sartre used it and Heidegger and all that, but it kind of reads like a self-help book sometimes.
I mean,
Yeah,
I feel
definitely. Go ahead, Sean.
Okay. I feel like a lot of other philosophy could theoretically be accused of that, right? Like, I think you could, for instance, accuse Stoicism of being self-help. It's obviously not self-help for Christians. Although, I mean, you could probably pull double duty. I've tried giving Stoic books to Christians before, but I haven't had very much success with that. I am worried that this is going to derail, but it's going to definitely derail in a direction that I like, because I think to answer your question, part of what we'd have to puzzle out is what the hell philosophy is. And one thing that I ask my students, this has become a ritual, I guess, so now I can say it's a thing I do instead of just a thing I have done. But pretty much every semester for one of my classes, I ask my students, why, this is a philosophy class, right? Why isn't it a psychology class, right? Or why isn't it a sociology class? Or why isn't it a natural sciences class of some kind? And I think that, I mean, we can see Kierkegaard doing a lot of different things, right? Like we can see him being an amateur psychologist, almost like Freudian, which is always interesting because it does seem like the Freudians, I see more and more Christians invoking like Freudian concepts in order to explain things, which is just very amusing. But maybe they've always been doing that. Maybe they've been doing it longer than Freud has. The other thing I would say is, like, I think that one very dismissive thing that we could do, so I guess this is me being a dirty, gross anthropologist. We could, you're saying, okay, well, why isn't this like Christian self-help or something like that? I mean, I think that Christian self-help is a very primitive form of philosophy. I use the word primitive, so actually I'm not being a very good anthropologist, but right, like they are trying to answer questions like, what does a good life look like? And, how does the world work? They're just doing it in ways that, we don't think are very interesting or impressive most of the time. So that would be my response to your points.
Yeah, I guess, maybe the notion of the good life is maybe I don't know why that didn't pop me into my mind, but yeah, I mean, like, the Greeks were all about what is the good life in a really broad sense rather than in a narrow ethical sense. So maybe that's as good an answer as any. Okay, proceed.
All right. So I think on one level you could see, okay, just basically going off of kind of what Sean was saying and whatnot. I think a lot of philosophy, especially in ancient Greek kind of mode of philosophizing, it was about a way of life, a mode of living, and it was practical in that sense. Basically, since Socrates, I think he was the person who sort of focused on those practical ethical questions. I guess you'd call it practical. And then from there, you get yeah, it's definitely illegal. Pretty much everything I post is illegal. So just let you guys know. Yeah, it's all good. So yeah, I think with self-help, you do get that kind of primitive, savage sort of philosophy in the sense that it's trying to sort of orient people in their lives and in their living. And I think philosophy is something kind of like that. You know, that you do have speculative questions that seem to have no consequence for how you would live or whatnot, which I think that's always going to be a part of philosophy. But at the same time, I think philosophy is always going to also be about what we actually have an interest in, which is essentially our lives. So yeah, I definitely get the sense though that there's almost like a alternative sort of motivation to this text. And at times it seems like, wait, is he basically just saying, yeah, you think you're happy, you know, but really you don't know God, so you're not really happy. And is it basically, does it come down to that? I don't think it's that simple. At times it kind of seems like it, but then when it starts to get too simplistic, usually, and I'm just like, oh God, I don't want to hear about this. Then he'll actually sort of turn it around and start going in all these interesting directions that make it really worth reading. So personally, I found reading this it's hilarious. I think it's just a funny book. It's just I'm suspecting that Hunter's going to have a lot to say because there's a lot of stuff about Hegel in this. But it was almost more of a comedy to me than like pure philosophy. You know, I could see why you would basically like question, like, you know, what exactly is going on with this, because he's clearly, you know, he's doing this indirect discourse and like speaking this ironic kind of voice where he's kind of like pretending to be Hegelian, but then, and he kind of is, but he's also in a way kind of reversing Hegel in a lot of ways, because instead of, you know, this unfolding dialectic towards, you know, greater self-consciousness of the absolute or whatever, instead of that, you're actually getting this dialectic into greater despair through consciousness. So it's this interesting kind of, and also the way that, so Hegel is all about the collective, you know, and it seems like Kierkegaard, he's instead focusing on the individual. So I think that's probably one of the biggest distinctions going on there. But yeah, this, I found it just hilarious, like laugh out loud, funny at multiple times. So just for that, I've really enjoyed reading this. Yeah.
Maybe this is because of Hunter, but I see Hegel and kind of dialectic as being this sort of thing that you can, like, maybe isn't best approached, but there's an interesting kind of way to approach it through humor. And I guess I just see that in Kierkegaard, and, you know, like my conception of Hegel is largely through Hunter, which is, you know, partly why I'm kind of interested in reading Phenomenology of Spirit, you know, so I can kind of develop my own understanding that's kind of separate. But I think that, you know, yeah, I guess any time where Kierkegaard is kind of talking and he's like, I think there's literally a part where he's like, I don't know how to approach this without like satire, without kind of making a joke out of this. And yeah, and I see that as being very kind of dialectical, and I guess, you know, if this is a self-help book for Christianity, it's a really interesting one, you know, and I think in my opinion, I think that self-help, kind of defining something as a self-help book, is kind of a demeaning sort of characteristic, you know. I mean, it's just kind of, in my opinion, it's kind of describing it as too straightforward to be philosophy. Kind of like, you know, here is this solution and this will work and go from it. And I, although, you know, Kierkegaard's talking about salvation and he's talking about Christianity, I don't think for him it's as clear as go to God and this is your salvation. I think that he sees, I think what we're going to find is that the closer you are to God, kind of the deeper you sink into despair. But also the closer you are and the more potential you have for this sort of salvation. So I don't think it's as clear as, you have to go to God. I think that he is making an argument of what God really means, and that it's not something so clear. It's not something that you're going to make sense of. It's not something that you're going to come to a certain realization and be happy with. It's like, every sort of realization comes with this sort of despair, and it is this thing that kind of holds on to whatever connection you have to Christianity or not Christianity. So I guess that's kind of how I see it. It's just, I have a feeling that it's not going to become clearer as we go, and that there's going to be some solution as to what we need to do to get out of despair. I think that despair is sort of linked very closely with with Christianity, with God, with having a relationship with him, and that there isn't any sort of easy solution. And so I think him describing all these different types of despair and how someone who seems happy can be in despair and all this is just kind of describing the complexity and therefore the the strength, the kind of like eternity inside of despair, and I think that to me is stuff that I've clearly read in other philosophers, and I don't really see as self-help, just because I think that it's like I'm not going to read this book and then move on. Like, I'm not going to feel like I have a solution. I'm not going to feel like whatever solution I have is clear, or that there's a clear action. It's something that I have to kind of make sense of, and then after I've made sense of it, it's still kind of unclear. And through the process of kind of living and seeing that in sort of your daily life and other philosophers, that's kind of the way that I at least consume philosophy, and that's how I see it as different from self-help.
I've never read the second half of this book, so maybe I'll be wrong about this, but I brought up a few times this thing about repetition, and I can't, I of course can't find it right now, but I did find something, and I think it was in this week's reading, where Kierkegaard says something either directly or pretty close to that you can't, kind of like Travis is saying, you can't just like I was taught as a kid, you recite this formula and now you're done. But that this is something you have to you have to continually repeat this act of resting in God and all that. And so that's one reason why I said I'm not even sure he's that concerned with happiness, because frankly, to me, that still sounds like a pretty anxious way to live, where you're having to constantly make this, I don't know what, spiritual or mental or affective movement, or else you're just gonna, it's like you're on this knife edge all the time, it sounds like. And you're, and how long can you stay on the knife edge? And I don't even know if Kierkegaard tells us anywhere. I have no idea what he says about life after death. Is it like, if you just happen to not be in despair when you die, you go to heaven? That seems probably unlikely, but anyway, yeah, that's, I can see what you're saying there.
I think in a lot of ways, like, Kierkegaard is this perfect distillation of Christianity, or a perfect distillation of one possible way of doing Christianity. But it is like, and I think that in a lot of ways is what's interesting about it to me, is just being able to see someone like sit down, like, oh God, I forget if I've mentioned this before. Right. To a certain extent, I think that there is something, because at the same time, there's something deeply interesting about his critique of cultural Christians that is interesting. Like, it is simultaneously like, there are so many Americans with that critique that just view so many people as, going along with Christianity to get along. But even so many of the people who have that critique and behave that way are the type of people that Kierkegaard would criticize. But then again, that's so Protestant too, is to criticize all the other people in the church next door because they're getting it wrong when they're just, they're doing it like 5% differently from how you're doing it. But I do think that, like, so one way that I have presented Kierkegaard before, right, in mostly fair enough. The what am I looking for here? My brain is blanking on words. Like, I think of Kierkegaard a lot through the lens of Camus, just because, right, I came at him after Camus, and Camus talks about him a lot, so it's hard for me not to see that. And what is interesting to me is that I do think a lot of Kierkegaard's analysis of selves, I don't want to say I'm fully on board with it all, but it certainly, like, it makes sense. And the bits of it that I think are even wrong, I do find like intuitive and like make sense as like a first guess at how persons work, right? Like, I think he has a very sophisticated account of his analysis of people and how they live. And I think that his analysis of like the person in demonic despair is itself like interesting insofar because that's the one that everyone always talks about. All the other ones, like, we read about them and we listen about them and we go, okay, yeah, I can imagine a person who behaves like that. I'm pretty sure I've seen a person that behaves like that in all sorts of different contexts. But I don't think it. Sorry, I'm losing my way a lot here. Yeah, the thought's gone. I'm sorry. I'm gonna just stop talking. Maybe it'll come back to me.
Are you in despair, Sean?
A little bit. The fuse box. So basically, I was trying to plug in lights for this, like, I don't know, 10 minutes before the thing, and I plugged in a light and it like shut off like everything in my living room. All the other stuff in the house worked, but that didn't work. And then I couldn't find the fuse box. I had to call maintenance, and I hit my head while I was looking. So I'm very frazzled at the moment. I apologize. Everything works now. But I am just like.
So does that mean you're dependent on immediacy and external things for not being or not seeming to be in despair?
Much more
say.
dependent on immediacy in this particular moment. Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I think I recaptured what I was talking about. So I was talking about demonic despair, right? And I that's the one that we tend to focus on, and I think it's because it's the one that we associate with the philosopher, right? It's the philosopher is the person who's in demonic despair in terms of Kierkegaard's strata. It's the one that's aware of the problem, but Kierkegaard is criticizing for the way that the person in demonic despair deals with the problem, right? Whereas all of the other variants are like, assholes that or sometimes very nice people, right? I don't want to paint with a broad brush, that you find in your life and his analysis of like what their problem is, basically. And in that sense, I mean, like I guess to be a little bit like suspicious of it for a moment, it's a little bit like flattering to the introspective person, right? Because it says that their despair is everybody's in despair, so in that sense, right, they're sort of alleviated from the traditional problems, thinking that all of these other people are fine and functioning, and you are this weirdo who's crashing. No, everybody's in despair. It's just that you're the one who's dealing with it the best. But then Kierkegaard wants you to go one step farther and embrace God as a solution to this despair. So I think in that sense, I worry a little bit about taking Kierkegaard too seriously, but I think I worry about it because not necessarily because I think I don't find his analysis plausible. I mean, there's bits of it that I want to like quibble with, particularly the end bit, right, the Jesus bit. But it does seem to me like I'm worried that I find Kierkegaard so plausible because he is in a certain weird sort of way being flattering of the type of thought process that is mine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It's definitely, I don't know, it's kind of strange because you can see he targets almost everyone. I think what he's really good at, and I think this applies to Nietzsche as well, is basically this kind of sympathetic intuition in the kind of Bergsonian sense of being able to really pick up on the kind of introspective dynamic of people, almost like a moral psychology, I would say, for Nietzsche, how he's just a master of understanding kind of what makes people tick in this very internal dimension, I guess. But then Kierkegaard, he does the same thing and describes all of these different types of people. And I think everyone understands, you know, who he's talking about in a way, or at least I do. You know, and you know, speaking of the self-help thing, especially the way it was presented as, you know, I think it was Travis who was talking about, you know, is this necessarily, you know, a bunch of, say, what was it, 10 rules for life or whatever? Is it something like that, where it's just these external codes that you just simplistically follow? So that's one of the things he critiques as, you know, that's the wisdom of the world. This person that, you know, externally they appear very adjusted, you know, but then internally there's something asymmetrically disjointed about them. But they can't really name it because all they really know is, yes, 12 rules for life. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And so he's really critiquing that idea as well. But then that leads towards this kind of irony, because in a way what he's doing is something almost is at least somewhat similar, you know. But the thing is, okay, so you can go in and look and see, oh, that applies to all these other people, but then of course you're always going to look also, well, which one am I, you know, which despair am I? So that's, I kept reading it this way of trying to be like, okay, what am I would have classified myself here, you know. And I found that none of them directly really describe me, but almost all of them have at least one component that I felt applied to me and really kind of made explicit something that's really just very internal and intuitive. And I think that was one of the really interesting things about the way he's able to kind of bring those things out in a explicit manner, something that's so subtle about the way that we just tend to think, the way we tend to rationalize things and whatnot. So I found almost all of them have at least one component that at least one time in my life or another could have applied to me. And things also were like, oh, you know, I should pay attention to that because, you know, tending to look back at my previous life, do I have also this idea of growing up that is somewhat, so I can't remember what he calls this, but you know, he talks about the illusions that the adult has versus the child, like the child, the youth or whatever, has the illusion of hope. And then there's this illusion of, you know, just the course of life, just the natural unfolding of where you just go past these silly things that we believed as children, you know. And I think something like that is a good, you know, it doesn't matter what religion you are, basically realizing something of, wait, could I really not be as wise as I think I am just because I'm an adult? You know, something like that. You know, it's basic kind of Socratic sort of dialogue there. And, you know, I think we can really see a lot of ourselves and all these other people, these types of people, and in all these types of despair. And then, yeah, I think there is something sort of flattering about, you see, there's almost something good and bad, I guess you could say, about just about all of them, which kind of hints at a kind of dialectical sort of thing also, especially about introspection, because I found one of the things that probably most resonated with me is where he's talking about, oh, I can't remember the term, but he's basically talking about this movement towards the desire for solitude and whatnot as this kind of deepening of consciousness. So I felt like that resonated with me somewhat, in that I definitely feel the need for solitude frequently, and a lot of people that I know do not understand this about me. So I found that philosophers, people interested in philosophy or whatever, they tend to share this trait. There's something about introspection and philosophical thought that, you know, is a very obvious correlation there. In closing reserve, that's it, yeah. So I thought that was pretty interesting, that part of it, but ultimately he goes on to show how that also is this foreign despair that can lead towards, you know, arguably the worst kinds of despair, which would be, yeah, then that demonic despair. Although, what Sean, what you were saying about the demonic despair being the philosopher, so I didn't pick up on that, because I thought that, so there's part in there where he seems to basically be describing Hegel as this kind of person who believes in a like an abstract identity, and there's all these interesting dynamics about that. But then the thing is, he refers to that as stoicism. So that kind of took me back. So I was like, okay, maybe I misunderstood that then. So that one seemed to be really targeting philosophers, if anything, would be something like a combination of that in closing reserve and the stoicism thing about abstract identities. But then that demonic despair seems to be a really special mode of those other ones, really that in closing reserve who, you know, feels, well, yeah, y'all read it, so I don't need to describe it, but yeah, I picked up on the philosopher more so with the stoicism thing, but yeah, I don't know. That would be pretty brutal if demonic despair was basically just like philosophers in general. Yeah, I don't know.
Yes, I should kind of. Oh, did you want to go, Nevitt?
I was going to say this may come, I think, as a religious category, and maybe this just is because I first came to Kierkegaard from, you know, from a religious frame of reference, but I think literally Satan is the paradigm case of demonic despair. And, you know, and what, you know, after reading this, you know, I don't know if you noticed my little handle on what's that thing called?
Discord.
That's it. Is demonic despair, because you know, demonic despair, at least as a religious category, I think is when you know, when you say, I am fucked up, and God, you created me fucked up, and I am going to exist through all eternity to prove that you fucked up by creating me fucked up. I mean, it's this will to be me in all my terribleness as proof that, like, or what he puts it at the end of this is, you know, that God is a bad author, but that, you know, God created this mistake that is me, and I want to exist through all eternity as a proof that you are a bad God. And I mean, the reason that I kind of identified with that is because there's been a, you know, a period of my not too distant past where it had some degree to do with me as a person individually, but a lot of it had to do with just the world, that the world is such, you know, is such a messed up place, that it has so much suffering. I have never seen a compelling solution to the problem of suffering. I've seen various theological efforts, and they all seem to me to not work. And so I had this rage against God, because the world is such a hard place for so many people. And so that's why I thought of myself as a religious category. It's a rage against God, because you're blaming God, blaming God for doing this terrible thing. So, but then, this time when I was reading it, I noticed there's some slightly milder stages earlier on that I'm probably closer to than the full on demonic despair. So, but anyway, that's what as a religious category, I think of it more like that. And I hadn't really thought about where philosophers fit in, but I think at least as a direct religious book, I think he's got Satan as kind of the primary case, and then humans can get into something very close to that, where you literally want to say, I want to exist through all eternity in despair to prove that God is bad. Oops.
I was gonna say that demonic despair seems to be at the top of a hierarchy, and in order to get there, you'll have to have gone through all the other ones. And so that's why most of us around the room can identify with different parts of it, because we all, on Kierkegaard's account, we've all been in immediacy, and we pass through all the stages, and back and forth. And it reminds me, the way he characterizes demonic despair reminds me of Schelling with the inquiry, was it not Inquiry of Human Freedom? The essay over human freedom, his account of evil as the being which wants to be outside of the principle which created. I know he doesn't use that exact description, but the way he describes evil is this kind of stubborn desire to be apart from the grand plan, like the whole grand plan is, God willing the world into being so that he can, posit himself outside of himself, to know himself, to love all things. And then this one stubborn thing says, no, I'm a mistake and I hate you for making me, and I think to Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard's response, or God's response, would be like, who are you to call yourself a mistake? You're beautiful. You just have the wrong judgment, and your judgment can't supersede my judgment. And one more thing I just want to throw out there is I want to caution against overly using self-help as a term to describe this book, because I think one of the key points Kierkegaard is making is that you ultimately can't help yourself. At some point, you have to rely on the grace of God. I think, and part of the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I think a lot of the existentialists who took some of these key concepts from Kierkegaard kind of ignored that part. I want to say with Camus and Sartre, like, we have this idea that you can totally fashion yourself according to your with your radical freedom. And Kierkegaard wants to say, well, yeah, you can, but that's never your true self, right? This is a posit of yourself. And if that posit of yourself is at odds with your true self, the self that God created, you're causing problems for yourself. If you try to be something other than who you truly are, you're causing problems for yourself. And I don't know, I'm not an expert in the existentialist, but I want to say that this idea that you're trying to be something other than who you truly are would be incoherent to the existentialists. Does that make sense?
One way I'm not sure about this. One way I read Kierkegaard in relation to Sartre, anyway, in this business about devoting yourself to a project, the Sartrean notion. And sorry, Hunter, this is a kind of a repeat of what I said in class yesterday, which, judging from the reactions, they either didn't understand or thought I was stupid. But so the way I think about Kierkegaard's model of the self is, you've got these two poles, the finite, the infinite, variations on that. And then the self is this dynamic set of relations, between those, the self-reflective relation between those two, which means the self is not a thing, and he's probably borrowing here from Fichte and Schelling, but the self is a process. It's a dynamic process, but it's a dynamic, but within the self, there is no point of stability to give stability and structure to that process. So what happens is those relations tend to just shift and bounce around, or you go and stick to the infinite pole, or you go and stick to the finite pole, or you somehow try to force in and of yourself, this dynamic process. It's like water trying to freeze itself or something. It's like this dynamic process trying to somehow force stability. I think that's, that maybe that spirit thing, when you're trying to do it on your own without any help. And then I think, this is, it's my sort of, I don't know, image of what's going on. And then in order to get any sort of stability in that process, you've got to anchor it somewhere. And because there is no anchor point of stability within the self itself, you have to anchor it to something outside of that dynamic process. And for Kierkegaard, that's God, because because he's a Christian, and because God is the absolutely stable point. And so I'm not sure, I probably don't have the textual support for this on Sartre, but I'm thinking, Sartre may be thinking something similar. It's just that since there isn't a God, you've got to stake your life on something stable. You've got to pick a project and devote your life to it. Now, granted, you can always, for I guess one reason for Sartre, you could always change that is because to say the self is freedom, which Kierkegaard says, I think may just mean the self is a process. So there isn't any sort of thing that's going to constrict what that process does. But, for Kierkegaard, that point of stability, the only legitimate and effective point of stability would be God. Whereas I think for Sartre, it doesn't so much matter as long as you pick something to stake your life on. But since the self is freedom, you could, if you want to redefine yourself, pick a different project, for example, which again, maybe that's not really possible, but that's kind of the way I'm thinking of Sartre in relation to Kierkegaard is, maybe he agrees, maybe Sartre agrees, you've got to have some sort of anchor point for your life to give stability to these dynamic psychic processes. And since there isn't a God, there is no predefined ground on which you can stake your life. You have to just pick one, kind of.
Right. I would say Kierkegaard would say you absolutely cannot pick your ground though. Like there is God, and that is the ground. And if you choose another ground, that is an artificial construct. You're once again doing this false position of stability and causing problems for yourself. So what I want to say is, with Sartre, it just seems like you have who you are is a matter of choice. And in Kierkegaard, who you are is not a matter of choice. Although thinking that it's a matter of choice can lead to all sorts of problems. So, kind of bring it back, like I want to say he's not doing self-help. He's doing it's more like, Kierkegaard's not saying this is how you achieve enlightenment, or this is how you leave despair behind. This is the positive steps you can take to improve yourself. I don't see it like that. It's more like, hey, quit fucking yourself over. Like, it's more of a negative, like, quit doing these things to yourself. Quit telling yourself you're somebody you're not. Or quit telling yourself that you're a horrible human being. You're not a horrible human being. Or, you know what I mean? It's like, quit sabotaging yourself, which is not a positive plan to get out of despair, but just he's showing you what you're doing to yourself so that you might lessen it, if you like.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think that Kierkegaard is definitely taking something of like a descriptive stance rather than like a prescriptive stance. Like throughout this text, it seems like he's just kind of it feels like he's just unfurling this thing that's already in front of him, and he's just kind of talking about the way things are from his perspective, rather than saying like, I've got this idea, I've got this plan, guys. If you just hear me out, I swear to God, you'll feel great. Which I think some more modern intellectuals seem to be doing with their self-help books. But I'm going to leave that at the door. I wanted to talk about the process of despair and our kind of tendency right now to compare them to different schools of philosophy. I started basically. There's a certain point. He I think Kierkegaard's a really good writer, and every once in a while throughout the text he'll kind of like, all right, so what did we just kind of talk about? Like, what do we know so far? He's like, there's like these breaks in the text where it's like a paragraph saying like, all right, let's catch up on it. And there's a certain part where he says that okay, what did we do? Where have we gone? Where have we been? It was despair over the earthly, then the eternal, and then that turns into a defiance, and that defiance is despair by means of the eternal. And this defiant soul does not want to lose itself, which would be the only way to win itself through God and whatever, but to be itself. And then he says this defiance is this desire to construct itself. And he says that's a stoicism, or that's like a form of stoicism or whatever. And then talking about all these 20th century existentialist project, if I kind of localize it there, the next discussion after the Stoic discussion on defiance and so on, the very next discussion is on, he says this defiant despair can express itself or can be embodied in an active or a passive sense. And he says, okay, well, let's look at what those two are. Well, the active is this active despairing self that only relates to itself experimentally. And it's this restless spirit, and it bestows infinite significance onto its own enterprises, or it has the capacity to, at least from its well of infinite imagination and passion. And I think that it would be kind of his like prediction of the 20th century existentialist project, is taking your own enterprises and bestowing upon them infinite significance, right? I think that infinite significance that he talks about with his active despairing self is very much like that of 20th century atheist existentialism. The self is its own master. It has no given ground. It's all very echoing those ideas or those schools of thought, especially Sartre. At least my experience with Sartre back when I was super into him when I first kind of started this whole business. But I think the way that Kierkegaard describes it that is really good is that it's like a king with no country, a self who makes himself the king and says that he decides who does what and where they do it at and what it means, because he gives his own life its own meaning, because he's the king. And then kind of the ground underneath him is just this like sand. It's just this quicksand almost. It's this constantly, or like it's like a running river. It's just this complete lack of stability. And so he's not really the king of anything, any solid thing. And he never becomes his true self, but he gets away from himself in wanting to be itself. It becomes no self. And then it finds itself in the end to always be a riddle, because he sees that basically, I think that's an important part of this discussion that kind of puts us into the next thing, which will then I want to talk about demonic despair and the comparison to Hegel, and why I think it's an interesting comparison. I think, yes, we could at one point say, oh yeah, Hegel made this big, crazy, harebrained scheme of the universe, and Kierkegaard thinks he was silly and stupid, and he's goofing on him. He's saying, your little dialectic is gonna get you straight to hell, buddy. That's good. That's where that's gonna lend you, if you go to the end of that. But I think that there's a slightly more interesting, Nevin, I want to, we can reference that in a minute. I'll pass you the talking stick in a second, but I want to talk about Hegel. So basically, I think that Kierkegaard says that the active despairing self says that it finds itself in the end to always be a riddle, right? He finds this let's talk about this sense of vertigo, this anxiety, this groundlessness, like you are floating through a black abyss, and you are constantly rotating in a complete 360 degrees, with no orientation or stability at all, just wildly spinning out of control constantly, right? So Kierkegaard says that this is a process, a logicless process or experience. And in fact, at least he's skeptical of logic. And I think, based on my reading and the reading of Rebecca Comey and Frank Ruda, there's a tendency in Kierkegaard to put the will above the intellect. He puts will above intellect. And in that sense, he is skeptical of pure rationale, qua analytic philosophy. And they make an argument that that is a very firm sort of basis for the next generation of psychoanalytic thought. Being skeptical of this totally aware, conscious self that's totally in line with it, knows what it's doing, and it can outline everything in a neat little box. Psychoanalysis is very skeptical of that. It says, I think there are things going on here that you're not recognizing and perhaps not able to recognize. And Kierkegaard is kind of laying the groundwork for that. So he's saying that this is logical process or experience, right? So Hegel, if I can kind of take, let's say Hegel and Kierkegaard are looking at the same thing, is my first point. I think Hegel and Kierkegaard are looking at the same experience, which is this wild, totally fine, Nevitt, whatever. Mr. Persnickety on my analogy, I don't know. This totally ungrounded experience. It's a illogical process, but it's a process. Hegel says he takes a look at that same thing. Kierkegaard says, and this is why Kierkegaard really likes Socrates. Kierkegaard is very explicit. He loves Socrates because he very much values Socrates. Socrates is a kind of earnest approach to philosophy, being this kind of youthful gadfly sort of personality that would say that his whole point or his whole project was to say, like, look, everybody's just talking a bunch of bullshit. Everybody's just saying stuff that they don't know anything about. Everybody's lying to me all the time. And I don't know. I don't have any better answer, but you're obviously talking nonsense. And I want to point that out a little bit. I don't care, And Kierkegaard says, yes, that's great. The only thing I know is that I don't know anything, right? I know nothing. That's great. There's total radical uncertainty, right? This radical uncertainty that defines our need for God. This total lack of ground or certainty or absolute or whatever. Hegel says, okay, let's look at the logic of that illogical process. Basically, I know nothing except that I know nothing, but I know that for sure. I'm like certain of that. I know for a fact. I know totally and completely that I don't know anything. And what can I do with that? How far can I run with that idea? And that's kind of Hegel's response to skepticism. But I think that Hegel is close, or this comparison to demonic despair is interesting to me because it seems like the point of the demonic despairing subject, or at least the defining quality of the demonic despairing subject, is to exist in protest against all existence, right? To exist or embody and engender a living protest against all existence, or a proof of the misery of the world in an act of malice, right? That's what I'm getting, or at least that's what I have in my notes. I think that Hegel, at least as far as I'm aware in his in my understandings of his philosophy, it's something of a embodiment of mistakenness. This absolute taking up and embodying of being wrong and being a failure and being incorrect and never quite doing exactly what you want to do, or knowing what you want, or knowing what other people want, or knowing anything. It's just this constant exchange between poles of mystery that you're yanking us this way and that. And we get close to them sometimes, and then they turn out to just be this mirage every time. And I think that Hegel is just talking almost explicitly, definitely explicitly, but like almost exclusively about this experience of failure, and kind of the logic of that failure, and the structure of that failure. And I think in that sense, he is kind of like a demon. He's like Kierkegaard's notion of the demon, this person that lives in protest, that constantly talks about how fucked up everything is. And Hegel's doing it so well that Kierkegaard's like, oh no, he's giving over. I mean, this is a caricature, but it's almost like he's saying like, oh, Hegel's doing a really good job of painting the picture of how broken everything is. He's like Satan. he's like the trickster. He's like the snake telling me to eat the apple. He's telling me there's a dark side to God. What does that mean? Oh no. You know, I think that's kind of what I got out of it, but I don't know.
Hunter, I'm trying to understand still well, maybe this is, I don't know. I'm afraid this is probably going to take us too far from Kierkegaard. I'm still trying to get your reading on Hegel. So are you thinking then that Kierkegaard finds these contradictions in existence and says that the only possible resolution, or the closest you can get to a resolution, is through this resting in God, whereas Hegel just says, to use the analogy you were using in our class, that Hegel just wants to sharpen these contradictions to the breaking point, and then what happens what happens when they break? So one, is that a correct read? And two, what happened? How does that help anything or do anything, or does it help us understand anything? Like, what's the point of sharpening these contradictions to that breaking point?
I think that Hegel would say that that's kind of the movement of the concepts, the dialectic, that we can kind of embody or push. In fact, he actually said that's kind of what they mean when they say the owl of Minerva flying at night. I'm writing a paper about this kind of, or I'm not writing a paper. I had this one class that asks me to do these really banal discussion posts about, like, oh, well, do you agree with ethical relativism? And I was just like, okay, I'm kind of bored, and I just drank some coffee. I'm going to type way more than I should about, like, why I absolutely do not at all, like, and why I just have this really hard line. And I was like, okay, so if we follow Kant, blah 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 blah, and like, I totally this overblown and overly complex answer to this question. But as a part of it, I referenced this idea of Hegel's. Basically, if I could talk about his idea of what philosophy is, because we were talking recently about what philosophy is in this very seminar, in this particular meeting. So let's talk about it. Let's see what Hegel says. I'm so glad that I remembered. Let me just write a note on a Post-it note. Okay, there we go. So for Kant, everything known, and I put in everything known, everything we can know, in a way, and everybody that's good at Kant in this room, check my math, because I might be totally off base. But seriously, yes, you keep an eye on me. All right, so everything, like, I'm trying to give it like the best possible reading. I'm trying to see, like, if I actually do understand Kant here. According to Kant, he says that everything that we know, or that we can know, everything known is in a sense normative. Thought and all action, thought and action, are all based in judgment, in this sort of active or this experience of, or an active or embodiment of, I don't know what he would call it, this something of judgment, this judgment. And the norms that kind of define or shape or affect that judgment, the norms that affect that judgment, are given or transcendental, given/transcendental. And Hegel says, okay, you're right in some sense. I accept that there are norms. There are definitely norms that are in this way kind of given in a sense. But he takes that norm and he embeds it into social reality. I think that Hegel says that, okay, there are norms there's a normative sort of system going on, but let's embed that in social reality. And he says that intersubjective practice, talking to each other and speaking Menschatssprach, or the cosmopolitan tongue, this intersubjective practice works both in and on, the norms that govern it. The norms that govern this intersubjective practice, as in this context, Hegel says, well, when we experience that intersubjective practice, when we participate, not only do we work inside of that practice and the norms that govern it, but we kind of shape it and change it, and it warps and wiggles, as we do it. And he says, here we reshape and we reaffirm our norms, as well as our commitment to them, and if they're still good, if they're still valid, and if we want to keep doing it. And I think that this is the reason, and this is a part of another paper I'm writing, why Hegel, I think, is called the philosopher of recognition. I think that this is like at least a key part in this. I mean, that and the theory of mutual recognition, which I'm going to borrow a lot from Hulgate on, but I think this recognition, this sort of intersubjective practice working in and on governing norms is a big thing. And then, so to take this idea further, there's no consistent foothold or frame for us to stand in or to judge the whole of experience or the world. Every context has limits and negativity, even relativism and historical relativism, but that's just kind of throwing shade at them. Philosophy, for Hegel, this is the point. For Hegel, the job of philosophy in this limited negative framework that it's kind of oppressed by, philosophy's job is to think what is eternal in the present and transform it in every present. And it's so the things for us that are eternally true, that have, oh, of course, no duh, they were not eternally true at a certain point, and they might not be at a different point in time. But for Hegel, at a certain point, there were things that he could deduce were eternally true, at least in his day, in his present age. and it sounds funny, but really, that's why he says that there's this absolute, this connection to the absolute for him. But my point is this exceeding and this extending of our context. Philosophy's job is to exceed and to extend this context that we're stuck in. And that is, I think, what he's referencing in the part where he's talking about the owl of Minerva flying at night after everything's already happened and getting the life of the groundwork for tomorrow, or what the world's going to look like tomorrow. I really do think that. But to return to like the initial thing, which was why does he sharpen these antagonisms to a shattering point, right? I think that he would say that this is the way that the concept functions. The way that the concept functions is that this sharpening of antagonisms or whatever, that is our kind of process in endeavoring to push concepts and to understand concepts, right? But the notion of like dialectics as a whole, like just concepts without our like directly sitting down at a table with the philosopher's degree and saying, I'm going to philosophize, I'm going to take this concept and then yank it left and right until it starts giving me something that I can write a book about. That's a way that he would describe this sharpening of the spears until they shatter and destroy the framework, where we can figure things out, like formalism is superior to empiricism in a lot of ways, but only because it fails better. We can learn things like that if we sit down at our philosophy table and we write our stupid little notes. But he says that these concepts, not only in our stupid little books that we love to write and read from one another, but in like society, in the individual's mind, in the town that he lives in the country that he lives in the world that he lives in the genus writ large, the self-identity of a thing, meaning anything having any sort of identity, is grounded for Hegel in failure. And okay, the way that I can describe this is, okay, he has a famous quote, "A rose is a rose." It's like, okay, sweet. What do we learn? And he said, he's not just saying nothing. He's saying there's a difference between a thing and itself. Okay, I used this example before. If I'm at a dinner party with you all, and then I am at the dinner party and we have friends over that have never met any of us, or never met me at least. I've never met me. And then I say something horribly misogynist or something. And then I excuse myself to go to the bathroom after saying something horribly misogynist as a joke and being like, wasn't that funny? And then I leave. And then everybody's kind of, or somebody at least turns to the guest and says, oh, I mean, that's just, Hunter is just, he's going to be Hunter, I mean. Hunter is Hunter at a certain point, you know, and it's like, oh, what do you mean there? Do you mean to say that the content is exceeding its form in some sense? The notion of the second phrase, Hunter will be Hunter, you know, boys will be boys. The second the second utteration of boys or of Hunter or of yes, from the predicates of identity. Chase is kind of cutting to the chase, which is that self-identity is grounded in the failure of the predicative. And so for Hegel, there's this consistent failure of the predicate of its identity to totally encapsulate itself. And so in that sense, with one, there is always two. There's always going to be, because there's a thing and then that thing, you know, and the difference between them, right? And so one, a true one for Hegel is impossible. It's just totally impossible. And that's why I think a lot of people are silly when they say, isn't he trying to shove everything into a one? He's like, well, that's just empirically not true. So one is impossible. And in this sense, for Hegel, two is less than one. Because you see why? It's the difference between the two. It's this one version of the thing. The rose is a rose, and here we have this new notion of the rose, right? It's one plus a void as the mark of its impossibility. Thank you, Electra. The two is less than one, in that two is one plus a void that is the mark of its impossibility. So dialectical opposition for Hegel of concepts is a thing and a second element. And that second element just fills in the void of the innate incompleteness of the other, the born in, internal, immanent incompleteness. And so I think that, yes, Kierkegaard would say nothing makes sense, and in order to make things make sense, we gotta leap over like the Berlin Wall. We gotta just jump over to heaven, into God, right? Because what else are we gonna do? Sit here and scratch our heads? And Hegel would say, well, that head scratching has something of a. Hegel said, well, that head scratching has a meaning. It has this structure. There's this sort of logic to the way that we scratch our heads, and in some sense you're right, you know, Kierkegaard, it is all we can do, you know, and so let's do it. I guess.
Yeah, I don't know if I can really add on that. I was just, while you were talking, I was thinking about kind of my own conception of Kierkegaard and trying to make sense of it with what you said, and I just get the feeling it's someone described it as this sort of like sympathetic, like there are certain writers, to me, I think Camus does it as well, where it's like they'll disagree with something but at the same time clearly be like, look, I respect this person for what they're doing, you know. And it's like there's kind of this underlying assumption that it's like this demonic despair, this reserved, all these despairs aren't any better than my despair. They aren't any better than me going to God and having faith. But this is how I do it, you know? And so I don't think that in any way he is trying to like tell non-Christians to become Christian. I think he is just trying to get Christians to think about philosophy. And to see that what they're doing isn't so different from what Hegel is doing or from all these other philosophers. I think that he reads Hegel and he reads all these philosophers and he's like, look, I'm doing that too. We aren't so different, you and I. Like, and he's not trying to say, it's kind of like what I was talking before. When I saw that God, to me, was my friends, or it was philosophy, it was all these things. And instead of rejecting that because of that, Kierkegaard's saying, look, this is all philosophy as well. You know, this is what I'm doing. And what Hegel is doing, what all these people are doing, I'm going to jokingly make fun of it because that's the only way I know how to kind of approach this and say, look, and I'm sure that Kierkegaard sees in himself all these attributes. You know, I'm sure that he has experienced demonic despair. I'm sure that he's reserved himself and not said what he's thinking. You know, it's like you can tell that he relates to it, and that he's kind of trying to say here, like, Christianity is just a form of philosophy, you know, and we can think about it this way, and we can proceed forward. We don't have to throw Christianity away because it doesn't exactly fit into this philosophical perspective. It's like, this is a philosophy, you know, and I think that that's I think that's really cool. And there are things that Kierkegaard says that almost like the way some of you guys describe it are things like my mom have said to me, you know, and it's like I can look at that as like, oh, like Kierkegaard's just going down to the level of simplicity that my mom is trying to describe Christianity to me. No, what my mom is trying to say is philosophical, is real, is something relatable, and the you know, like in a real sense, she's relating to this philosopher from the 1800s when she tries to tell me that I need some stable thing to hold on to because everything else isn't stable, you know, that everything else has a chance to disappear and go away, you know. And so my mom's worry about me not having that stable thing, you know, I think is like, it comes across as this very clear, like, oh, you need this, you need to do this, and so you're going to do it. But I think what she's really trying to describe is her own personal experience of losing everything that she thought was real and having to decide on something to hold on to that is stable. And to hold on to art or to hold on to something physical or isn't bad. It's just not what Kierkegaard did. And from my understanding, I think that he is just kind of trying to describe his own demonic despair through the process of God. And in ways kind of describing God as being a sort of demon, as not being so far from the devil, as being close to it, you know. And I think that fits in with all these sort of dialectics. It's like yeah, thanks, James. Everything I say is just, it's just Deleuze. He already did it and did it better. Just shut up. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, you know, I think it's cool, and I think that, you know, I've kind of turned around very much in this sort of respect for Christianity, and I think that Kierkegaard describes it well. It's like, you know, look, if we're ever going to be able to communicate with people who are Christian, and if we ever want to philosophize with them, we have to understand where they're coming from. We have to see what they're doing as philosophy, or else we will just further distance ourselves from them and never be able to talk to them about the things that matter to us. You know, it's just this way of communicating to a group, you know. And I'm sure at this point, like in history, a lot of the philosophers who were, you know, focused on rationality were not Christians, you know, and there was probably this atheist Christian sort of, you know, dichotomy that I think he's trying to break through and say, you know, look, this is real and this matters, and this isn't just like, I can look at your philosophy and say that it's the same thing as what you think Christians are doing. You know, you're trying to run away from all your problems and you think you're better, and for having read this book, you suddenly have this idea that, you know, you're better or you figured it out more, and you haven't. But I also haven't figured it out. It's not that simple. So yeah, that's all.
One thing I wonder is, you know, Kierkegaard says everybody's in despair. And even if you're not in despair, you actually are in despair and just don't know it, which is, you know, how do you disprove that claim? But I mean, you know, when I read Kierkegaard, I identify with a lot of the states of mind he describes. But then I wonder, you know, again, is that just because I'm into some of the same kind of things he is? You know, like Travis, you know, describing your mom, you know, she experienced some things that seem to resonate with Kierkegaard. And I think Kierkegaard would say that everybody does. I just wonder if that's true. You know, I mean, is it, So, you know, what does make sense to me is that, and maybe it's because I experienced this in my own life, there is always, whether all I have to do is just pay a little bit of attention, and there's always this undercurrent of anxiety and probably despair that's always flowing just under the surface of my mind. And I just have to kind of turn my attention to it. And yeah, there it is. I mean, sometimes I feel it emotionally and viscerally. Sometimes I don't seem to feel it, but then if the thought occurs to me, I'm like, oh, nope, there it is, still there. And I think Kierkegaard would say that's true for everybody. I wonder if that's actually the case, or if that's only the case for people like us. You know, are there people for whom they don't have that undercurrent and it's not really there? You know, like I've run into people, you know, guys that said, well, aren't, you know, don't you care about, you know, whether life has meaning or, you know, this or that? Like, no, don't really care. And you know, I guess Kierkegaard would say they're lying to themselves. I don't know.
I think I would argue with Kierkegaard and against these people who feel that, you know, that they're perfectly fine as they are. I mean, I'm thinking of Adorno here. I want to say that, you know, like in this society, there is no possibility of living a fulfilled and happy life, right? It's a fundamentally antagonistic society that maims every member of it in one way or another. We're all objectified. We're all exploited. We're all disrespected in our full humanity. We're not given the dignity we deserve. There are all sorts, and we don't give ourselves the dignity we deserve. I mean, I want to side with Kierkegaard here that we all suffer. I mean, this human condition is universal and it comes with suffering, all of it. And if anybody out there believes that they're not suffering, they're lying to themselves. If you can watch Netflix and hit your bong all day, every day, then maybe you can convince yourself you're not in despair, but that doesn't mean that you're actually happy and fulfilled. That is not a life worth living. However much you run away from it, you're still miserable. Does that make sense?
No, I just drink my Pabst and I'm happy. No. Yeah, I think there's some good points. So I really think they're basically what a lot of people have been talking about made me realize kind of another dimension to this whole sort of relational sort of modality that he's setting up, is that he's, by giving us these different forms of despair, he's giving us also a way to kind of relate to these people in these other states as something that's not totally foreign. So I think the fact that there is, so I agree with Nevitt in the sense that, I know Hunter would agree with this too, that there is this kind of background of anxiety or dis-ease or something like that, and I think that is universal, and that is an aspect probably of reflexive self-consciousness that I think everyone, at least every kind of should say typical human probably has, then they can probably relate to that. So I think based off that, you've got one way that we can all relate to each other, in the sense that I think everyone does at least have, whether it's explicit or not, some kind of way of understanding that there's something else going on beyond just a kind of, okay, you ask somebody, how are you? What are they going to say? Good, fine. That's always going to be such a ridiculous oversimplification that that one word cannot possibly grasp the multiplicity of emotional affects that are just swarming under the surface at all times in a living person. So I think because of that, that contrast, there's always going to be some kind of, I guess what Kierkegaard would call despair or anxiety because of that. And what he's kind of doing is finding a way that I think because we all share that, that's how we can intuit these other states of despair as well. So I almost see it in a Bergsonian way that Kierkegaard is kind of picking up on these. Maybe not. I don't think he's had every single form of these despairs, and that's the only possible way that he could ever have this knowledge. But he's definitely had some of them, and from that he can kind of extrapolate from there through this kind of intuitive sympathy, also based off of just observing people. And I think he's kind of maybe not calling us to do that, but at least giving us a kind of, not system, but a way of seeing how other people relate to ourselves based off that, and also how we relate to those other people. So he's giving us kind of another way of, our relating to itself in a way through other relations. So once again, he's kind of putting in that sort of meta reference of relations with our own consciousness by understanding other people's consciousness in the form of despair. And I think that's a way of kind of bringing about an awareness of our own state and seeing how we're not totally different. And I think he's got some good points about not only the people that I think, the typical philosopher, we would see somebody like the person of immediacy as this kind of comical, ridiculous figure that we can all kind of laugh at. Which one does he say is comical? I can't remember which one it is. But is that, I think that's later on in it. Or is that, no, I think that is the person of immediacy or something like that. But then from there, I think there's also a way that we can see that these other forms of despair actually do apply to us in some way. And because of that, it gets us to really look introspectively at our own selves. And I think that's really what he wants us to do. Not so much to kind of put us in a category ourselves, but I think he just wants us to, in a way, be more self-reflective. Just like Socrates, what did he do? The Athenians, they've got this oral tradition of epic poetry where people memorize things in rhythms and then repeat them. And that's basically truth, is this kind of collective enunciation of these repeated phrases. And everyone knows what justice is based off of, well, there's this instance of justice, in the Odyssey of this or that. And everyone knows it because of that. Okay, Socrates is basically saying, no, actually, truth is something that you have to get to individually, that we get to universal truth through the individual. That's the only way it comes about. Otherwise, it leads to these abstract universals, I guess. I don't know. I guess I'm kind of basing that off of Hegel's interpretation of Socrates, but that's a different story. So I think I'll just end it there.
I just want to say really quick, it would seriously, like, I refuse to talk about this because it's like it would just, the rest of the time would just be me explaining this one Hegelian idea. But I think that I agree with Kierkegaard and Hegel and Socrates kind of in this this mutual agreement of reaching the universal through the individual. And through individuation and personality, and and I think that Hegel would say that I think that Hegel kind of came to this this sort of connection between the individual and the universal in two ways. In one sense, he says that the individual's experience mirrors this experience of the society, which mirrors the experience of the state, which is of the system, of the world, of the whatever, right? But also, I think that he talks about this a lot. I recently read talked about this in Meaning of Life, but I recently read like a big long thing by Hegel where he was talking about differential calculus. It was like 60 some odd pages of Hegel talking about differential calculus in a super dramatic and like overly like he's really bummed out about the fact that he has to do it, I think. And he really hates math. I think he like hates differential calculus, but he's like, look, they proved something that I said they couldn't do. And so we got to talk about that. All right, fine. And the reason that I say this is that it's one problem. It's not even like differential calculus at all, like as a whole thing. It's one part of because I don't even know if he knew a lot about calculus. He knew one part of it. Actually, no, I think he did. I think he was he was just like a weird Encyclopedia Brown style person who just wrote down a lot of stuff all the time. He was a real brainiac, but he only talked about one problem in differential calculus, which was the tangent line against a circle. Given a point on a circle, a line being drawn across that point, what would the angle of that line be? And his reasoning is, okay, so we're taking like quanta on both sides, these points, these quanta, and somehow we're taking quanta and we're describing a quality of something, i.e. spatial direction. He says that spatial direction of a thing is a quality. And he says that quality and quantity are disparate elements, and that you can't, and a big project of his was to show that quality is its own sort of realm, and that philosophy should be concerned with qualitative examination and analysis rather than quantitative. At least, especially if you read like Gadamer, if you read Gadamer's interpretation of Hegel and Hegel's dialectic, especially in his analysis of Hegel and the ancient philosophers, which is a small essay at the beginning, he talks a lot about Hegel's kind of initial aversions to quanta. And so in this essay, I think this kind of represents a turning point for Hegel, where he's like, okay, listen, I want to kind of dispel this myth about me, which is that I think that material things and mathematics and so on, the mathematical infinite is this determinate and relative infinite because it takes place in a series, right? But the real infinite, the independent infinite, the greater infinite, I guess, rather, as opposed to this like alf null kind of thing. Yes, I can agree. The real infinite is when I think about finitude, when I trip out on my couch and I think about how finite everything is, and then I think about the infinite and how that's like this crazy realm outside of, oh my God. And he's like, I think a lot of people would say, or seem to, in a way, like assume that like I am under the impression that this metaphysical infinite is greater or more expansive than an infinite that is stuck inside of a little math problem. Differences of kind rather than degree. Thank you, Jackson. But he says, no, I want to reverse that. And he says, and we're going to use this tangent line problem to kind of explain why there's the mathematical infinite is he says this metaphysical infinite that we can think of, this metaphysical infinite of the infinite, this infinitude or whatever, is relative. He says, I know that it would seem absolute and crazy and blah, but it's relative. It's relative, but it seems absolute because its limit is external to it. And that limit is the finite or the subject. And everything outside of the subject is the infinite. Oh my God. And then it kind of swallows me up, and it's centered around this position of experience of finitude. But the mathematical infinite for him is not outside of the series of finite numbers. It's not external to the series of finite numbers. It is the infinity of that series. It's the infinite expression or existence or collection of a series of like beings in the series. And so this infinity being in the series means that we can effectively use it or give it independence, and therefore we reduce quanta down to infinitely small things, i.e. points, and then we can use two quanta that are infinitely reduced down in the series and given independence to determine qualia through quanta. But my point is, this is just, yeah, there are different degrees of mathematical infinity. I think that Hegel would agree. And I think that one expression of the difference between two, like alpha null and alpha whatever the other one is, would be his kind of description of the difference between metaphysical infinite and the mathematical infinite. But basically, the reason I bring this up is just because I think that this is kind of his reasoning as to this individual getting to the universal, the true universal for him, or like the the non-relative infinite is the infinite that is of the series, rather than this infinite, this non-finite, this, oh my God, this crazy stuff all outside the series. And the stuff inside the series is like its contingent explosions and exceptions and mistakes. And he says that's there, that's well and good, and I think about it a lot, but it's relative. It's relative to me and to all the stuff I experience and to the world and whatever, or to the finite. But the mathematical infinite is made of the finite. That's crazy. That's the real stuff. And that is only possible because it includes the beings in the series with the hyphen in between each thing, the beings in the series. So the only way for the community of believers to exist is through a series of beings in the series. There's not this negative container of God as a mighty person that can come down and yo-yo his son back and forth between the earth until we learn our lesson or whatever. Sorry, that's a little derisive, but yes, that's sorry. And now Sean, you typed something, but I didn't read it. So sorry, I'm muting myself now so somebody else can talk. So sorry.
I mean, I think I typed the thing and then I realized that everybody else had said basically the exact same thing. So it was kind of just everybody was mentioning Cantor and countable infinities versus uncountable and different forms of infinity. But I think that you talked about something that, I don't know, I was curious as to whether or not you thought that was a good analogy effectively, but I kind of felt like as I was even typing it out, and this is the way I phrased my thing, was like, that probably isn't actually quite what you mean, but maybe it would be like a good analogy for what you mean, like a good example, but like purely within the realm of mathematics about the difference that you're pointing to.
Yeah, I also, just to be the difference between countable and uncountable infinities for Hegel is represented in his notion of the bad and the good infinite, which I know he's such an authoritarian. Bad and good, who gives him the right? all infinites are beautiful. For him, the bad infinite is when you have to count forever to signify infinity. There's countable infinity. There's like, well, all right, I guess it's infinity. We got to get to work. We got to start showing infinity, because they're not going to believe us if we don't. they're going to call us liars. And he just says that copulation of a species is an example of capitulation to the bad infinity. And that's a wild
That sounds
idea.
like Schopenhauer.
Well, he sounds like everybody. He's like, he's great. But he says the good infinity is that in thought, you capture the limit. You capture the limit in thought. And so I don't really know. Actually, maybe the countable infinite and the uncountable infinite, I don't think he was much of a mathematician in his spare time. I don't know if the countable infinite and the uncountable infinite might both just fit into the good infinity, which is this capturing of the limit of infinitude into thought. rather than having to like count forever in the series to signify infinity.
So that'd be pretty interesting to see how, because what you're saying about the calculus, that sounds almost exactly like what I believe Bergson's take on calculus is that it's something well, kind of related to Schelling. It's almost like the irreducible remainder, the indivisible remainder, where of course you have. Actually, I don't want to explain the calculus thing. Never mind. But the thing about Cantor's infinity and whatnot, and the way of the particular and the universal, I think that's an interesting point where Hegel and Kierkegaard would meet up, in the sense that, okay, maybe you have all these different infinities, and although you can see it on through this kind of mathematical lens, there's also these qualities kind of mixed in there that show a kind of irreducible individuality as well. And my mom is coming. Okay. My mom has food for me. Okay.
I figured you wouldn't turn down that.
Okay. So.
No, Mom.
She left. She didn't care. Yeah. Okay. So I think what's going on is that there's some kind of qualitative aspect that can't be reduced to just numbers in a kind of homogeneous sense, where just one number, one unit is the same as any other unit. And I think Kierkegaard is kind of pointing out that fact by saying that, yeah, okay, we all need to sort of be stabilized by the absolute, by the infinite. But the only way we can do that is by going about through our own kind of qualitative particularity through this point. And we have to get situated with that first. Sort of in the same process that we get situated with that infinite, because they're related necessarily, because the self is relating itself to itself. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's pretty, at least that's my way of trying to kind of put all those things together. Hegel, calculus, qualities, quantities, Socrates, universal particular, Kierkegaard, self, relations. I don't know. I just love all inclusive systems that understand everything perfectly in absolute knowledge.
I have a question that is going to be a non sequitur, so I don't know if anybody wanted to continue with that. So I'm still struggling with what's the difference between, this is a vocabulary question, spirit and self. So, I mean, what I'm tempted to say, based on stuff that I read here and maybe a comment that somebody made last time, is that spirit, because I'm thinking of that diagram that I stole from a book. There's spiritlessness and there's also spirit, and I'm tempted to say that spirit is when you bring the two poles, the infinite and the finite, into you try to bring them into relation and to one another. So you can kind of try to generate your own spirit by doing this. And if I'm right about this, then Kierkegaard would call that actually spirit, but it's not, I don't know if he would say it's inauthentic or it's not stable, but it's not, it's not going to last the way it would if you rest in God. But the spirit is this, whereas spiritlessness is kind of maybe slamming up against one of the poles, trying to become all infinite or all finite. But anyway, that's just my speculation. I'm still not sure what he means. You know, is that what he means by spirit, and how's that related to the idea of self? I mean, what I'm thinking of self is that whole dynamic, all those relations relating to relations and relating to themselves and relationally relating, and that's self or the lack of self. But then I'm wondering, like, what is spirit just when you try to bring those two poles together, or, you know, to hang them together in some sort of stable arrangement?
I mean,
Well-
oh,
Okay.
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. I was gonna say, I thought spirit was bigger than self. I thought self was R1 or whatever, and spirit was the big thing that had all the stuff in it. I don't know. That's all.
Right. To be fair, I think that might be compatible with the description that Nevitt just gave, insofar as like spirit is like a category of things that are the attempt to like bring together the infinite and the finite, right? But that would include, right, finding grounding in God, but that might also include some other things. But I honestly, like, I'm struggling to even think of, like, I feel like Kierkegaard uses these words. I don't want to say he uses them interchangeably, but he uses them often enough in ways that look interchangeable to me that I wouldn't even know how to begin to figure out. Like, I'm trying to think of like instances or vocabulary or something.
So I know he defines spiritlessness in a pretty specific way in the reading. I can't remember what he actually said about it, but yeah, so the self and spirit are definitely different for him, at least. But yeah, it would be interesting to go and look, because he talks about spiritlessness in a kind of specific way, where I don't think he's necessarily given a really exact definition of spirit. So I think you almost have to do it dialectically, and look at the negative of spiritlessness first, and then try to gauge, what spirit is from that.
Right. I think maybe approaching it dialectically would make the most sense in this particular instance, because I have a feeling that spirit isn't like a concrete and definite thing for Kierkegaard.
Just looking at, you don't have to turn there, but on page 67, when he's talking about this last state, this defiance, will to be oneself, willing to be oneself, I choose to be this as an error before God. And he said, and he calls this despair considered within the qualification of spirit. So I'm not sure what that means. I guess I'm thinking, trying to fit that in with what I said earlier, that in that despairing state, because some of those states, again, it's a person is adopting the finite perspective, finite part or the infinite part, but in this last state of despair, it's like the person's trying to because he says, that in that last state, the person's trying to construct his own self, which is, like Eric said, is pretty much what Sartre seems to be trying to do. Is Eric gone now? And so that makes me wonder if that, that would be consistent with what I was saying before, that the reason that last state is spirited, is despair in the category of spirit, is because this person is trying to hold those two poles together, himself, as opposed to shifting to one side or the other. But we don't have to, belabor this. It's just a question I'm struggling with here.
So I don't know who's read this book before, but I saw that the next part is about sin. Basically, like, sin is despair. So I'm kind of curious exactly how it's gonna go from here. I don't know if anyone wants to give me a preview, or if they can, or I'm curious.
But you already figured out Hegel is bad. So Hegel is the sinner here. So we should just. So we're supposed to be done here. Here's a question. Maybe you guys can answer this quickly. What's the, Kierkegaard is all about inwardness, in a lot of his books. It's like inwardness, and that seems to be correlated to this notion of increasing degrees of consciousness, like this increasing intensity of consciousness. But then he, this what was that word? We are all completely self-absorbed. Chase, what was that called? Enclosing reserve. So what's the difference between enclosing reserve and inwardness? I mean, toward the end, this is the bottom of 72, he says enclosing reserve could be called inwardness with a jammed lock. So I don't know what that means. So I'm wondering what's the difference between good inwardness and bad inwardness, or inwardness with a jammed lock, because that's not good, but inwardness is good. So what's the difference?
Off the top of my head, a good Christian loves his neighbor.
A good Christian what?
A good Christian will love their neighbor, even their enemy. But if you're locked inwardness, then you have no regard for your neighbor at all.
Yeah, I think I can't remember. I can never remember it either. What are the locked in inwardness? That's something that can't relate outside of itself. Why is everyone like snickering? Yeah. I always see this is like bad infinite inwardness now, because I always think people are going to be like, they're snickering at me, surely, and then I realized, that's probably, who knows, maybe that's true. I don't know.
We're having private conversations about me and you is what's going on here.
I think
That
you're
is
right.
the truly terrifying thing about chat, right? Is that people can be independently messaging each other rather than putting it in general chat.
Yeah.
So there could be conversations going on that we're not seeing.
Yeah, clearly there's something going on with Hunter, Travis, Electra was, I think, laughing too. There's something. I did something. I think, yeah, you guys are gaslighting me. That's totally it.
I'm confused too. So
One thing I do particularly love, just as a random aside, is how much my students insist upon messaging me directly, because I'm pretty sure it doesn't default to that in Zoom, but they almost all do it. Like none of them put stuff in general chat, and I'm like, this is a philosophy class. You have to talk to each other. Message people other than me.
Yeah, it doesn't do that by default unless. So if someone messages you privately, then it defaults.
And then, right, and so then I accidentally start doing that, and I get pissed off. I was gonna say with sin. So I don't think I've ever sat down and read this whole book for sure. I'm pretty sure I've read bits of it. But one thing I will say is that I think if Camus' take is anything like Kierkegaard's, which is right, I'm just constantly running with this, like assuming I know what I'm talking about because I read Camus once, well, more than once, but I mean, Camus does think that Kierkegaard's conception of sin comes in the form of this desire, what he describes as this desire to know, or the desire to have like a satisfying answer to the divine meaning that God would be imposing upon the world. It's like, this is his criticism of like Christian existentialism, essentially. And the interesting way that he puts that is he thinks that it's for like simultaneously the one thing that the absurd like thinker can feel that they're guilty of, and then yet also feel like it constitutes their innocence, right? That's his interesting play on this, is that it's simultaneously true that the desire to have like that desire to have knowledge of God's concrete plan for the world, and to have like this coherent understanding apart from a reliance upon God in particular, is like something that they're guilty of in the way that the Christian is thinking about things. Because for Camus, it's what leads to demonic despair, right? Is this desire for coherence and complete knowledge apart from like an appeal to divine will, is what the questioner is guilty of. But for Camus, he says, you're guilty of it, but it's also like, for you, what constitutes being moral or ethical is the expectation that the world should be interpretable in a just sense, right? Not just interpretable in the sense that it's, that like analysis is possible of it, but interpretable in a way that is meaningful to human beings. So that's my best guess on what the connection for that is, if that makes sense.
What was I talking about before all this? I can't even remember now. Yeah, the Camus comparison is interesting. It's also interesting to see just how so many later followers of Kierkegaard and existentialism took so much from Kierkegaard. I think it was Sean. I think it was you who said, you're reminded of Camus when reading this. I'm reminded a lot of Heidegger when I read this. So yeah, same thing, but they all seem to pretty much throw out the Christianity aspect to a large degree. So it's kind of, I don't know, ironic, I guess. Is it an irony? I don't know. But also I just realized how funny the name Camus is. Camus. Moo.
It's Camus.
Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Ams.
He's got the word moo. Basically, it's like mooing. Yeah, that's funny to me. I don't know. I'm just trying to lighten the
Lighten the mood.
I think it's the Pabst talking.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. I actually have I have a box of Franzia too. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I still have a class in like an hour.
It's White Claw next, isn't it, Chase?
I think so, yeah.
You at least ought to drink Bodabox and I don't know, Shiner instead of Pabst and Franzia. I mean, have a little self-respect.
So both Franzia and Pabst have a lot of nostalgic value actually for me. So I don't know, you can basically psychoanalyze that all you want, but yeah, there's a emotional attachment to both of them. Yeah, I don't even want to go into the ways that kind of adds up, but yeah.
Comfort alcohol.
Pabst Blue Ribbon is great. I love it.
I definitely, I associate it with getting drunk with my buddies at Zelix, drinking pictures of PBR. So that is for me. I don't even know if I like PBR that much, but it has sentimental value in that way for me. For sure.
I was a good Southern Baptist boy, so I never got drunk when I was young.
Take that back. PBR is delicious.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm just saying I don't even know if I can analyze its taste at this point. It just has meaning to me. I don't know if it has flavor. It might be good, it might be bad. I don't know.
Hegel would not have drunk PBR.
What? No, PBR is clearly the winner of the antagonism. It's the sharper of the two spears. It fails better.
Wouldn't he have drunk some nice dark beer?
The synthesis. There's the synthesis of the opposites. Yeah. I mean, it's got it won some kind of award. The blue ribbon.
The blue ribbon, right?
Yeah. So clearly, yeah.
Okay. Well,
That's
are
my
we
argument
done?
I totally agree. Hegel and PBR. I mean, that's really why I get PBR.
So sad.
All the other beer is sublated into PBR. You're just not willing to accept that. You're a Luddite.
No, I have a I kind of like what is it? New Belgium Brewery, but part of that is because I lived in Fort Collins for Colorado a long time, and the brewery started when I was there, and then a friend of mine was the electrician that wired their first brewery. And also what I like is I like variety packs, so I tend to get that one or the Sam Adams variety pack, or occasionally the Shiner variety pack, because I like to have a, although occasionally, God, Sam Adams one time had this, what did they call it? Smoky beer. And it tasted like someone had poured a bottle of liquid smoke into the beer. It was awful. And then what New Belgium Brewery one time had, believe it or not, Ben and Jerry's ice cream beer. It was hideous. It was disgusting. So anyway.
Yeah. Smoke and ice cream don't sound like they go well with beer.
Terrible.
I could see ice cream and beer if I was already drunk. Put it that way.
I tell you what's good is making a float with a good dark stout. Now
See, that's what I
is
would.
good. Yeah.
I could see that. I could even see like I don't know, like a Shiner and some vanilla. Again, if I'm already drunk, I think that would go pretty well. If I wasn't already drunk, I'm not saying it would be bad. I would just be like, meh. But if I was already drunk, I'd probably be like, heck, this is good.
If this pandemic is ever over, we'll have to have an ice cream and beer party.
You know what we need to do? If we end up reading Finnegan's Wake,
Yeah, please.
we need to have a lot of Guinness on hand, because Guinness is very important. Guinness is the elixir of life. It's the
Resurrection.
blood of Christ. It's
Blood.
everything. Yeah.
I had Guinness in the Guinness Brewery once.
Two.
Actually, I had two of them because my wife got one and she doesn't like beer, so I drank hers too. It was a good day.
I went to Dublin the first time I was reading Ulysses.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I would have maybe after all this Ulysses and maybe even Finnegan's Wake. Who knows? I that would be really cool to go there one day, actually see it. Because even Finnegan's Wake, he puts in, there's like the whole geography and history of Dublin. He said in Ulysses that, if Dublin was destroyed or whatever, you could recreate it out of Ulysses, which is
There are
interesting
actually
idea. Yeah.
there's actually markers around certain places in Dublin that are markers for different scenes in the book.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, and they've
I
got.
think maybe Craig would pay for us to all go to Dublin after we finish.
Definitely.
Okay, are we done yet?
I feel like that came to a resolution there. Yeah.
Okay, we have reached Aufgehoben, or
All
Aufgehoben,
agreed.
or one of those.
Aufgeheben.
Aufgeheben.
I thought it was Aufheb. Hold on. Well,
I think geheben is like one of it's like go and going. One of them is a verb, and one of them is what's the other one? Gerund or
all
something?
right. I found
Yeah.
Aufheben.
Aufgeheben is the verb. I know that.
I'm not. Are you sure? Because I think the ge is like putting ing on the end of a word. I thought. But
No. So if the
I'm German stupid. Oh right, you actually have been.
yeah.
No, I mean, Hegel's term is Aufhebung.
Yeah.
It's just Aufhebung.
That's the gerund. Yeah.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
But Aufhebung, there's another thing. It's like aufgehoben. And aufgehoben is what the fuck language? Oh, it's also a German word. Okay.
So that sounds like it's probably a verb too. Is the en is the infinitive, and also the first person plural and the third person plural, typically.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's probably a verb.
I want to know if Electra is doing research and looking up German words, or if she's like watching a episode of some cartoon or something.
Gossip Girl. That's what I'm doing.
Oh, sorry. I got a second monitor here that I got everything pulled up on.
Okay, well,
I need to get. a
What do you
second
think?
monitor.
I think
Oh.
I'm the a-hole who plays games while we do these talks, right? I'm the one here just like,
I've been writing emails to students occasionally because they're sending me these, like, why the hell did I get dropped from my class to your class? And my answer was because you didn't pay your tuition, which is actually true.
Hmm.
So I said, go talk to the registrar. Now, he
Yeah.
says, can you put me back in your class? I'm like, no, I cannot do that if you don't pay your bills. There's nothing I can do about that.
but
Anyway.
I can if you pay me money.
That's right. I said, if you pay, yeah, that's right. Pay
You
me
pay
enough
me money, I will put you back in the class.
Yeah, I sometimes tell my students, you can bribe me for an A in this course, but you would have to pay me like $1 million because it would have to be enough that I could invest and live off of it for a long time because I wouldn't have a job. And if you could bribe me with $1 million, you would not be at a state university. So
It's a good point. Yeah.
Some of them have got some GameStop shares, and they might be willing to give you that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Should I stop this nonsense now?
Yes.
I guess you
Okay.
should give us a merciful end.
Okay, I'm going
Bye,
to
everyone.
terminate.